A blood-curdling scream echoed through the hotel hallway. A cleaning lady had just discovered the lifeless body of a guest in a locked room. Blood splattered on the floor, and the murder weapon lay beside the victim. Within hours, the police had found a suspect and declared the case solved. But no one suspected that this was only the beginning of a series of horrifying secrets that had been buried for a long time. This woman was Susan. Previously, she was a senior editor at Cloverleaf Books in London. 2 years earlier, Alan, the company's most popular crime fiction writer, had been murdered. Susan, as Alan's exclusive editor, was also caught up in the case and nearly lost her life. After Alan's death, Cloverleaf Books' business performance deteriorated and eventually led to its dissolution. After losing her job, Susan and her boyfriend moved to an island in Greece to open a resort. Lately, the resort's business has been struggling, and Susan and her boyfriend are barely making ends meet. Just then, an elderly couple, Lawrence and Pauline, arrive on the island seeking Susan's help investigating a mysterious disappearance. They, along with their 2 daughters, Cecily and Lisa, run a luxury hotel in London. Not long ago, their youngest daughter, Cecily, suddenly disappeared. Her disappearance seems to be connected to a detective novel Susan helped edit, which is why they've traveled so far to seek her help. The story begins the day before Cecily and her husband, Aidan, got married 8 years ago. That day, Lawrence's hotel hosted a rather picky, middle-aged male guest named Frank. Frank was extremely dissatisfied with his assigned room and unexpectedly requested a room change. But the next day was Lawrence's wedding day for Cecily, so all the other rooms in the hotel were already booked by wedding guests. Therefore, he couldn't fulfill this request. Fortunately, Aidan was tactful and quickly negotiated with the other guests to make room for Frank, much to his satisfaction. The following morning, as she prepared for her wedding, Cecily was extremely anxious. It turned out she was particularly superstitious and strongly believed in astrology. Cecily was a Sagittarius. According to online horoscope predictions, Sagittarius might encounter misfortune today. However, Cecily's mother, sister, Aidan, and other relatives downplayed the worry. Unexpectedly, a sudden murder occurred. Afterward, Cecily and Aidan's wedding proceeded as planned. Just as the couple were exchanging sweet glances and exchanging vows, Natasha, a hotel maid, suddenly rushed to the scene, interrupting the ceremony. It turned out that while cleaning Frank's room, she was shocked to find him lying motionless on the bed with his head covered in blood. He appeared to have been dead for some time. A blood-stained hammer lay on the floor, likely the murder weapon. Upon hearing the news, everyone immediately called the police. The police arrived at the hotel shortly afterward to investigate the scene and examine the body. The forensic examination revealed that Frank's time of death was between 11 and 12 midnight the previous night. The cause of death was determined to be a severe blow to the head, leading to mechanical asphyxiation. The murder weapon was identified as a hammer found on the floor of the room. However, police found no fingerprints of the perpetrator on it. Furthermore, the money Frank was carrying had been stolen. At first glance, the incident appears to be a burglary followed by murder. However, the doors and windows at the scene showed no signs of forced entry. This means Frank either opened the door for the perpetrator or the perpetrator used a key card to unlock the room. Clearly, regardless of the hypothesis, hotel staff are potentially involved in the case. More importantly, Frank had only recently arrived in the area and checked into the hotel on the day of the murder. In such an unfamiliar place, he probably wouldn't have proactively opened the door for a stranger who wasn't a hotel employee late at night. Based on clues gathered at the crime scene, the police quickly narrowed down a suspect to Stefan, a hotel maintenance worker. According to Lisa and Lawrence, due to the nature of his job, Stefan was issued a multi-purpose hotel access card, allowing him free access to any room. Furthermore, Stefan had a prior criminal record for theft and had served several years in prison. The hotel owner, Lawrence, had decided to hire Stefan as a maintenance worker in response to the government's call for job opportunities for reformed offenders. However, recently the hotel had experienced a series of thefts. Lisa suspected Stefan was the culprit and had announced his dismissal. After Cecily's wedding, Stefan was to leave the hotel. Therefore, when the hotel unexpectedly experienced a theft leading to murder, Lisa couldn't help but suspect Stefan was responsible. Besides Lisa, the hotel receptionist also provided testimony unfavorable to Stefan. According to his recollection, on the night of the crime, the wedding guests and most of the hotel staff were attending a pre-wedding party in the backyard. He was the only one on duty in the lobby on the first floor. Around 11:30 at night, a dog suddenly barked from the second floor. This was the dog that Lawrence's family owned at the hotel, which usually liked to sleep at the top of the stairs on the second floor and rarely barked without reason. Hearing the noise, he immediately ran upstairs to check the situation. There, he saw a figure passing by the door of the victim Frank's room. Although he couldn't see the person's face clearly, based on the clothing and the toolbox in their hand, he deduced it was Stefan, the hotel's maintenance office worker. At the time, he thought Stefan was just working and didn't question or stop him. Based on Lisa's testimony and the receptionist's statement, the police immediately searched the dormitory where Stefan lived and obtained a crucial finding. There were a few drops of Frank's blood on Stefan's bedsheets. Hidden in a book at the edge of the woods were some blood-stained banknotes, the cash Frank had stolen. With such clear evidence and witnesses, Stefan was quickly arrested. He promptly confessed to the crime and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Frank murder case was thus closed. Cecily and Aiden's wedding, though interrupted, was fortunately unaffected. Soon after, Cecily gave birth to a daughter. The family's life was peaceful and happy. However, just a few days ago, after finishing a detective novel, Cecily suddenly called Lawrence while he was resting at home. In a panicked voice, she claimed that Stefan was not the real killer in Frank's murder the previous year. The true killer's identity was hidden in the detective novel she was reading. The author of this novel is Alan, a writer for Cloverleaf Books, who was murdered. Alan used the murder of Frank as the model for his detective novel, Moonflower Murders. This is also part of Alan's most famous series, the Articut series of crime-solving novels. Many people involved in that year's case were created by Alan as characters in the book. Lawrence was about to ask Cecily over the phone who the real killer was when the call was suddenly cut off and Cecily disappeared shortly afterward. The police searched for days but found no trace of her. Lawrence suspected that the killer realized Cecily had discovered a clue and had killed or imprisoned her. This time, Lawrence and Pauline came here hoping Susan could help decipher the contents of the novel Moonflower Murders. Susan was formerly Alan's exclusive editor and also the editor-in-chief of Moonflower Murders. Now that Alan was dead, Susan feared she was the only one who could decipher the secrets he had hidden in the book. Therefore, the Lawrences agreed to pay her £10,000 as a fee. For someone as short on money as Susan, this was considered a good deal. Moreover, she was curious to know what secret Cecily had discovered in the book. So, after some thought, Susan happily accepted the Lawrences' commission. Over the next 2 days, she reviewed the contents of Moonflower Murders. The novel's story takes place in rural England in 1954. The protagonist is Melissa, formerly a famous Hollywood actress. In a filming accident, Melissa suffered a long gash on her cheek, leaving an indelible scar. Unable to accept her fans seeing an imperfect image of herself, she announced her retirement. Melissa then returned to her birthplace, a county in Devon, England, to open a hotel called Moonflower Hotel, hiring John and his wife, professional managers, to run it. The hotel was named after the film Moonflower, which had earned Melissa a prestigious award. Thanks to the film's fame and Melissa's own reputation, Moonflower Hotel was always packed with guests. However, strangely, despite the booming business, the hotel suffered losses year after year. Therefore, Melissa began to suspect John and his wife were embezzling the hotel's assets. That day, she confronted them directly, frankly questioning why the hotel had been losing money for so long. Upon hearing this, John and his wife immediately panicked and were unable to offer any reasonable explanation. However, Melissa had prepared for this. Melissa contacted her financial advisor, Marsh, and planned to conduct a thorough audit of the Moonlight Hotel's books. If John and his wife had indeed misappropriated the hotel's funds, Melissa declared that she would not hesitate to send them both to jail. Just as Melissa finished her threat and was about to leave the hotel, Hollywood producer Oscar stopped her. It turned out that Oscar had spent years meticulously crafting a script specifically for Melissa. Unexpectedly, before filming even began, Melissa announced her retirement due to an accident that disfigured her. If Melissa didn't participate in the film, Oscar would face a huge breach of contract penalty from the investors. Therefore, he had repeatedly tried to persuade Melissa to return, but she always refused. And this time was no exception. Watching Melissa's retreating figure, a glint of resentment flashed in Oscar's eyes. On her drive home, Melissa happened to pass by her personal physician, Leonard. Because she was in a bad mood, she didn't notice that the person behind the wheel of the car opposite her was her doctor. Leonard, although he saw Melissa, didn't initiate a conversation with her because he had just received an important letter. The sender was Samantha's aunt's lawyer. The lawyer mentioned in the letter that since Samantha's aunt had no children, before she passed away, she had made a will, leaving her entire enormous inheritance worth £980,000 to Samantha. Leonard was eager to share this good news with his wife. However, after returning home and informing his wife about the inheritance, he received some very upsetting news from Samantha herself. It turned out that Samantha's younger brother, Marsh, would be coming from London to Devon that day to handle business and would be staying overnight at their house. In fact, Marsh was Melissa's personal financial advisor. His trip was, of course, to assist Melissa in auditing the hotel's finances. Leonard utterly detested his brother-in-law, Marsh, who was greedy, cunning, and extravagant. He would occasionally come to his sister's house begging for money. Leonard had specifically instructed his wife not to reveal to her brother that he had inherited inherited his aunt's property. Otherwise, given Marsh's nature, he would certainly try to seize the inheritance. Meanwhile, Marsh was driving to Melissa's mansion. This man was truly a fool, as he was smoking and drinking while driving. As a result, in a moment of distraction, he hit a pedestrian crossing the road. Seeing this, Marsh quickly got out of the car to check on the situation. When he saw the victim lying motionless on the ground, he was so frightened that the cigarette in his hand fell to the road. Then, he immediately returned to his car and fled the scene in a panic. At the same time, Melissa had returned to her villa from the hotel. Her husband, John, immediately reminded her to quickly change her clothes and get ready to go out. John had already bought tickets for the opera for the day, planning to take his wife to see Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro. However, Melissa was preoccupied with the accounting issues of the Moonflower Hotel and had no mood to go to the opera. In truth, she had long harbored resentment towards her husband. John was inherently lazy. His parents, always considering their family background superior, looked down on Melissa's acting background and constantly opposed her marriage to John. After John insisted on marrying Melissa, he no longer received any financial support from his parents. From someone who comfortably relied on his parents, after marriage, John shifted to relying on his wife. Over time, as the initial enthusiasm and feelings cooled, Melissa found her husband's laziness increasingly unbearable. Their marriage was already on the verge of collapse. Therefore, Melissa directly used the excuse of needing to meet with her financial advisor Marsh to decline her husband's invitation. At the same time, she couldn't help but mock him, saying that all he did was eat, drink, and have fun. John couldn't tolerate his wife's words, leading to a huge argument. He then angrily slammed the door and left. Shortly after John left, Marsh arrived at Melissa's villa. Due to recent difficulties in managing her finances, in addition to entrusting Marsh with auditing the hotel's accounts, Melissa also demanded that he withdraw all the money she had invested in real estate projects. Although Marsh outwardly agreed to her requests, his expression was extremely grim. The so-called real estate project was actually a lie Marsh had concocted to deceive Melissa. He had long since squandered all of her investment money. Sure enough, shortly after Marsh left the villa that evening, Melissa was murdered in her own bedroom. 2 days after the crime, an American man, claiming to be Melissa's former manager, traveled from New York to London seeking out Detective Pun, a private investigator known for solving many bizarre cases, and offering him a hefty sum to investigate the real killer. After accepting the commission, Detective Pun immediately went to Melissa's villa with his assistant, Kane, to investigate the situation. The local police, having heard that this renowned detective was investigating Melissa's murder, specially dispatched an experienced inspector, Inspector Chubb, to assist Detective Pun's investigation. Thus, Detective Pun, Kane, and Inspector Chubb formed a temporary investigation team. The three first re-examined the entire crime scene, which was the second-floor bedroom of the villa where Melissa died. Since the police had already cleaned up the scene, Inspector Chubb had to recount the relevant details to Detective Pun and Kane. When discovered, Melissa's body had 2 distinct strangulation marks on her neck. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation using a telephone cord. The time of death was estimated to be between 6:28 and 6:38 p.m. on the day of the crime. This accuracy was possible because at 6:28 p.m., Melissa's personal physician, Leonard, unexpectedly received a distress call from her. In the phone call, Melissa was crying and desperately pleading for help, claiming that someone was trying to kill her. When faced with danger, Melissa didn't call the police immediately, but instead called her private doctor for help. The main reason was that the nearest police station was at least a half-hour drive from Melissa's villa, while Leonard's house was only about 5 minutes away. After receiving the call, Leonard immediately rushed to Melissa's house. However, due to panic, it took him a few extra minutes to start the car. By the time he arrived at Melissa's residence, she had already been murdered. Through the investigation, police confirmed that Melissa had used the landline phone on the first floor of the villa to call Leonard for help. Next to the phone were several crumpled pieces of tissue paper she had used to wipe away tears. After making the call, Melissa returned to her bedroom on the second floor. Finally, she was followed by the killer, who brutally strangled her to death using the telephone cord in her bedroom. Sadly, Melissa didn't reveal the identity of the person trying to kill her during that distress call. It remains unclear whether she genuinely doesn't know the killer's identity or is deliberately concealing something. Just as Inspector Chubb finished speaking, Kane, the assistant to Detective Pun, suddenly felt chest pain and dizziness. She hurriedly asked Detective Pun to open the closed window in the room to get some fresh air. Unexpectedly, as soon as Detective Pun turned to open the window, Kane's face went pale and she collapsed to the ground. In her fall, she accidentally dropped a stack of letters on the dressing table. Fortunately, she quickly regained her composure. It turned out that, although she had been Detective Pun's assistant for a year, this was the first time Kane had personally been at a crime scene, and she was understandably terrified. Seeing her condition, Detective Pun and Inspector Chubb immediately helped Kane down to the living room downstairs to rest. At that moment, John returned home from outside. Detective Pun took the opportunity to question him. According to John's account, besides him and Melissa, a mother and son normally lived in the villa. The mother was the villa's housekeeper, and the son was a male servant. On the night of the crime, the mother and son happened to be home on vacation, so only John and Melissa were left in the villa. After arguing with Melissa, John angrily left the house and went alone to see Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, returning late at night. In other words, John was not present at the scene at the time of the crime, and therefore could not provide any witness testimony. However, he still gave Detective Pun a list of suspects he was considering. First and foremost, the most suspicious were John and his wife, whom Melissa had hired to manage the hotel. Melissa suspected them of embezzling hotel funds and had called Marsh to prepare for an audit. It is highly likely that John and his wife, fearing their crime would be exposed, murdered Melissa. Secondly, the most suspected person is Hollywood producer Oscar. Melissa refused to star in the film that Oscar had painstakingly prepared for her, completely ruining his plans and forcing him to face a huge breach of contract penalty. It's highly likely that, driven by rage and a desire for revenge, Oscar ruthlessly murdered Melissa. Besides John and Oscar, John also believes Melissa's personal financial advisor, Marsh, had a motive for the crime. He had long suspected Marsh of using investment as a cover to embezzle Melissa's money. Furthermore, Melissa refused to go to the musical with John because she said she wanted to see Marsh. This means Marsh was very likely the last person to see Melissa while she was alive. This man is clearly a strong suspect. After concluding the interrogation of John, Detective Pun decided to split up with Inspector Chubb to carry out the investigation. Inspector Chubb visits theaters to verify John's alibi, while also investigating whether Marsh actually misappropriated Melissa's investment money. Meanwhile, Detective Pun takes Kane to the Moonlight Hotel to meet John and his wife, the hotel managers, for questioning. John and his wife claim that they were both in the hotel office checking and settling accounts during the time of the crime. To prove their innocence, they even give Detective Pun a draft of a love letter they claim to have found in Melissa's office trash can. Based on the content and handwriting, it appears Melissa had an extramarital affair, and the letter was written by her to her lover. Therefore, they suspect that John, after discovering his infidelity, became enraged and murdered his wife. Detective Pun remains silent on the couple's speculation. After the interrogation ended, he and Kane continued their investigation by contacting Hollywood producer Oscar. Oscar is currently staying at the Moonlight Hotel. Facing Detective Pun's questioning, Oscar admitted that on the very day of the crime, he had gone to Melissa's villa. It was probably around 6 o'clock in the evening, as his purpose for going was to persuade Melissa to participate in the film he was preparing to make. Unexpectedly, upon arriving at the villa's entrance, Oscar overheard Melissa arguing with the housekeeper and her daughter. For some unknown reason, Melissa threatened to fire them. Standing outside, Oscar only vaguely heard a strange remark about the hotel being vandalized. Seeing Melissa in a fit of rage, Oscar didn't want to get into trouble, so he immediately left the villa, intending to find another opportunity to persuade her. However, early the next morning, he received news of Melissa's death. If Oscar's testimony is true, then it seems there was also a conflict between the housekeeper and Melissa. Thus, the housekeeper and her son, who was working as a male servant, also seemed to be suspects. Furthermore, John had mentioned that on the day of the crime, the housekeeper and the male servant had just returned home on leave. If that were the case, why would they return to the mansion and argue with Melissa? Detective Pun probably never dreamed that his busy investigation for half a day would only complicate the case further. By dinner that evening, Inspector Chubb had compiled the clues he had gathered and shared them with Detective Pun and Kane. According to his investigation, the theater did not perform Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro on the night of the crime. This was because the lead actor had been hit by a car on his way to the theater and the driver had fled the scene. Fortunately, the actor survived, having been promptly taken to the hospital by witnesses, and his condition is now stabilizing. This also means Melissa's husband, John, lied to Detective Pun. Furthermore, Marsh did indeed pocket all of Melissa's investment money. This suggests both John and Marsh had motives and were suspicious of the case. The following morning, the three investigators returned to Melissa's villa to clarify the reason for the argument between the housekeeper and Melissa. The housekeeper claimed Melissa had misunderstood her and her son as having stolen property from the villa, which is why she threatened to evict them. Regarding Melissa's statement that the hotel had been damaged, the housekeeper stated that it had nothing to do with her and her son. According to her, Melissa was criticizing John and Marsh for embezzling funds and harming the hotel's business. However, Detective Pun clearly didn't believe this somewhat forced explanation. While deep Deep in thought, he suddenly remembered that there seemed to be a painting of the Moonflower Hotel hanging on the wall in the second-floor hallway of the villa. So, he immediately led everyone upstairs to check. After Detective Pun moved the painting from its hanging position, everyone discovered a small hole about 1 centimeter in diameter that had been drilled through the wall behind it. Through this hole, they could observe the situation inside Melissa's bedroom. Witnessing this, the male servant, who was also the son of the housekeeper, finally confessed the reason for his conflict with Melissa. It turned out that the male servant was a fervent admirer of Melissa. He had secretly drilled the hole in the wall with the intention of spying on her. On the day of the crime, Melissa accidentally discovered the hole and was extremely angry, immediately calling the housekeeper and the male servant, who were on leave at home, to return to the villa. She then loudly criticized their behavior and declared she would fire both of them. However, the male servant insisted that he and his mother would absolutely never murder Melissa over such a trivial matter. After their argument, Melissa kicked both of them out of the villa. After questioning the housekeeper and the male servant, the 3 detectives approached John and directly asked if he knew about Melissa's alleged affair. Upon hearing this question, John clearly showed signs of distress. After trying to remain calm, he insisted he knew absolutely nothing about it. However, when Inspector Chubb mentioned that the theater hadn't performed The Marriage of Figaro as usual on the day of the crime, John could no longer conceal his panic. He broke down on the spot and confessed that he had strangled his wife, Melissa, with a telephone cord. According to John's testimony, on the day of the crime, after arguing with Melissa and leaving the house, he was in a terrible mood, and instead of going to the theater, he wandered aimlessly outside for a while. Afterward, he quietly returned home, hoping to reconcile with Melissa. However, Melissa not only ignored John's pleas for reconciliation, but also frankly admitted that she had changed her mind and fallen in love with another man, declaring her decision to divorce him. In a fit of rage, John cut the telephone cord in the bedroom and used it to strangle Melissa to death. After committing the crime, he fled the house in panic. In recent days, John had been tormented by fear and guilt. After speaking, he begged Inspector Chubb to allow him to go upstairs to change into a decent coat, after which he would return to the police station with him for questioning. Inspector Chubb hesitated for a moment before agreeing to John's request. While the 3 detectives were waiting for him to change clothes in the downstairs living room, Kane accidentally discovered a figure lurking outside the window, peeking into the house. Upon being discovered, the figure immediately turned and ran away. Detective Pun and Inspector Chubb rushed outside, but after searching the area repeatedly, they couldn't find any trace of the peeping Tom. The only logical explanation was that the person had sneaked into the villa through the back kitchen door. When Detective Pun and Inspector Chubb reached the kitchen, they saw the housekeeper and the male servant preparing lunch for the day. Both insisted they hadn't been outside and hadn't seen anyone suspicious. However, Detective Pun noticed some mud on the male servant's shoes. Therefore, he suspected that the peeping Tom was most likely him. But before Detective Pun could begin questioning, he heard Kane's piercing scream from the living room. He and Inspector Chubb immediately ran back. They found a dagger plunged into John's chest. He staggered down the stairs from the second floor and collapsed dead in front of the 3 detectives. Since John was alone on the second floor at the time of the crime, Inspector Chubb speculated that he committed suicide out of remorse and fear of punishment. However, Detective Pun felt the situation was far from simple. The dagger used to kill John was a prop from a zombie movie that Melissa had collected. Detective Pun clearly remembered that the dagger was originally used as a decoration and always hung on the wall next to the staircase near the first floor. Meanwhile, John had insisted that he hadn't taken the dagger with him when he went upstairs to change clothes. Could it be that after going to the second floor, he went back down to the first floor, took the dagger when no one was looking, and then returned to the second floor to commit suicide? Wouldn't that be completely unnecessary and illogical? Furthermore, a question still lingered in Detective Pun's mind that he couldn't answer. According to the police investigation, before being murdered, Melissa used the landline phone on the first floor to call Leonard for help, then returned to her bedroom on the second floor after the call ended and was murdered. If that's the case, once Melissa confirmed on the phone that someone wanted to kill her, why would she return to her bedroom on the second floor where escape would be difficult? This clearly doesn't make sense. Furthermore, who was Melissa's mysterious lover, and was this person connected to the case? With a head full of questions, Detective Pun decided to contact Melissa's personal doctor, Leonard, and Leonard's brother-in-law, Marsh, to inquire about the situation. Currently, these are the only 2 men who have had a close relationship with Melissa. In other words, Melissa's alleged lover is most likely one of them, Leonard or Marsh. As the trio of detectives arrived at Leonard's house, Inspector Chubb noticed 2 cars parked there. The front bumper of the car with license plate L10N5 was noticeably deformed. Furthermore, the model of this car was strikingly similar to the car that had hit the musical actor, as described by witnesses. It seemed the owner of this car was the driver who had caused the accident that seriously injured the musical actor. Therefore, upon entering Leonard's house, Inspector Chubb inquired about the owner of the car. After learning that the owner of the car involved in the accident was Marsh, Inspector Chubb didn't immediately question the traffic accident, but instead took out a draft of Melissa's love letter and asked Leonard and Marsh which of them was Melissa's lover. At this point, Marsh was very cheerful and readily admitted to being Melissa's lover. However, he denied any involvement in Melissa's death. On the day of the crime, he did indeed go to Melissa's villa, but left around 5 o'clock. When Melissa was murdered, he was drinking in a bar. Besides, there were a number of witnesses to the time, so he had absolutely no time to commit the crime. After saying this, Marsh calmly lit a cigarette. Judging from his expression, he didn't seem to be lying. Inspector Chubb then questioned him about whether he had hit anyone with his car on the day of the crime. Marsh wanted to distance himself from the accident. Inspector Chubb immediately pointed to a cigarette butt that the police had picked up at the scene. This cigarette butt was the same brand as the cigarettes Marsh was smoking. Adding to that, the damaged front bumper of Marsh's car made it easy to deduce that he was the driver who hit the musical actress and then fled. Faced with Inspector Chubb's accusations, Marsh found himself unable to deny the truth and had to admit to the hit and run. However, he had already learned from the newspapers that the victim was no longer in danger. According to the relevant laws, at most, he would only have to pay compensation to settle the matter. As he spoke, Marsh turned to Leonard beside him, smugly asking, "Will you pay me this money?" Detective Pun sensed the threat in Marsh's tone. He vaguely felt that Marsh had discovered some weakness in Leonard. To clarify the ambiguity between the two, Detective Pun excused himself to get some fresh air and went alone to a nearby church. On the way there, he had coincidentally encountered Samantha going to church alone. Detective Pun did indeed meet Samantha inside the church. He learned from her that Samantha was about to inherit a massive estate of £980,000 from her distant aunt. Leonard had specifically warned his wife not to tell Marsh about this. However, what Samantha couldn't understand was that today, Leonard had proactively suggested she share half of the inheritance with Marsh. Samantha's inexplicable question helped solve many mysteries in Detective Pun's mind. Finally, with the help of Inspector Chubb, John confessed to murdering his wife. But in Detective Pun's eyes, John wasn't the real killer. On the day of the crime, after Melissa confessed to the affair and asked for a divorce, John, in a fit of rage, cut the telephone line in the bedroom and strangled Melissa, causing her to lose consciousness. However, Melissa wasn't dead yet, only in a coma. John mistakenly thought he had killed his wife and frantically fled the house. Shortly after he left, Melissa regained consciousness. Because John had cut the telephone line in the bedroom, Melissa had to run downstairs to call her private doctor, Leonard, for help. 5 minutes later, he drove to the villa, by which time Melissa had returned to her bedroom on the second floor to rest. Knowing her husband, John absolutely dared not return home that night. The reason she called Leonard for help, besides his house being the closest to the villa, was because he was her lover. Melissa hastily called Leonard to her house, perhaps because she had confronted her husband and wanted to urge Leonard to divorce his wife as well. But what Melissa didn't know was that Leonard was a calculating man who valued money above all else. This could be seen from his attitude towards his wife's inheritance and towards his sister-in-law. Leonard's affair with Melissa, besides lusting after her body, was likely driven by a greater desire to extract money from her. Currently, Melissa's hotel was losing money year after year, and Marsh had embezzled the investment funds. Leonard's wife, Samantha, was now entitled to inherit a huge fortune. Leonard naturally didn't want to divorce her. Seeing the marks on Melissa's neck and hearing that she had just been assaulted by her husband, Leonard immediately devised a perfect murder plan, strangling Melissa with a telephone cord. Doing so would not only free him from Melissa's clutches, but also frame John for the murder. This is why Melissa's neck bore the 2 strangulation marks. Leonard's murder plan went smoothly, but he didn't realize that Marsh had already seen through his affair with Melissa. While staying overnight, Marsh inadvertently discovered a letter about Samantha's sister inheriting the fortune, despite his own extravagant spending habits. Marsh then used her knowledge of Leonard and Melissa's affair as leverage to demand that Leonard give her half of Samantha's inheritance. Leonard feared that the affair would be exposed, leading to Samantha's eviction, and even more so, that his crime of murdering Melissa would be revealed. Therefore, he was forced to change his mind and persuade his wife to give Marsh half of the inheritance. After receiving the promise of the inheritance from Leonard, Marsh proactively admitted to Detective Pun and Inspector Chubb that he was Melissa's lover, intending to cover up for his brother-in-law. When Detective Pun deduced this, Samantha looked at her husband in astonishment. astonishment. Leonard still wanted to deny the accusation, but faced with his wife's terrified gaze, he realized that even if he could escape conviction, his wife's enormous inheritance would likely no longer be his. With a cold heart, Leonard decisively confessed to the murder. The police immediately arrested him on murder charges and took Marsh to the police station for questioning on suspicion of fraud and hit and run. After Melissa's murder case was solved, Detective Pun revealed the final mystery in front of Inspector Chubb and Kane: whether John committed suicide or was murdered. In truth, Detective Pun didn't want to face the answer, because not only was John murdered, but the killer was none other than Kane, standing right before him. Detective Pun knew that Kane was a fervent admirer of Melissa. According to local law, even if John were convicted of murdering his wife, he would only receive a life sentence. This was an outcome Kane, who had been infatuated with Melissa since childhood, could not accept. Therefore, she wanted to kill John herself to avenge her idol. In fact, from the moment the man claiming to be Melissa's former manager approached Detective Pun to investigate Melissa's murder, Detective Pun had sensed something amiss, because this person's American accent was clearly deliberately heavy. Perhaps Kane hired this person to impersonate Melissa's former manager to entrust Detective Pun with solving the case. In this way, Kane, as Detective Pun's assistant, could confirm the killer's identity before the police. This would allow her to find an opportunity to kill the culprit before they were caught, thus completing her revenge for her idol. Upon first examining the crime scene, Detective Pun immediately recognized the first postcard in the stack of letters on the dressing table as being from Kane. To conceal her identity as a fan, Kane even pretended to trip and knock over the stack of letters, using the opportunity to hide the postcard she sent to Melissa in her pocket. However, this act did not fool Detective Pun. When John confessed to being the real murderer of Melissa, Kane's emotions were noticeably altered. Just then, she happened to see the housekeeper's son peeking through the window, so she seized the opportunity to get Detective Pun and Inspector Chubb to leave. After they left, Kane grabbed the dagger hanging on the wall near the stairs, rushed upstairs, and stabbed John in a vital spot. Then, she quickly retreated downstairs and began screaming in panic, drawing Detective Pun and Inspector Chubb back in an attempt to make John's death look like a suicide. Although Detective Pun had seen through everything, he was still surprised that Kane would go to such lengths to help someone, ultimately leading to John's death. Later, the police discovered Kane's fingerprints on the dagger used to stab John. Kane was immediately arrested. The story of the novel Moonflower Murders finally concludes here. However, after reading this novel, Susan still felt extremely confused. In fact, she had heard about Frank's murder 8 years earlier. Frank was an old acquaintance of the author Alan, who wrote Moonflower Murders. Susan had heard Alan mention these cases, but she couldn't see any connection between the case in the book and Frank's murder. To find more clues, Susan took the novel with her, boarded a plane back to London, and began her own investigation. Her first stop was a luxurious hotel owned by the Lawrence family. Lawrence arranged a room for Susan to stay in after she unpacked her luggage. Susan imitated the style of Detective Pun from the novel and began questioning everyone involved in the case from that year, but the result was fruitless. Having exhausted all other options, Susan turned to James, the author Alan's former gay boyfriend, to find out more. Before writing Moonflower Murders, Alan had interviewed all the staff involved in the case. Susan wanted to ask James if he knew where Alan had kept the interview recordings from that year. What delighted Susan was that all of Alan's interview recordings, including his notebooks for writing the novel, were in James's possession. Based on the recordings provided by James, Cecily had complained more than once during the interview that the victim, Frank, was a con artist full of lies. Apparently, on the day of the crime, after checking into his hotel room, Frank had gone to Cecily and Aidan, who were preparing for their wedding, with his key card and claimed that his key was faulty and wouldn't open the door. He asked Aidan and Cecily to get him a new key card. However, Cecily, after taking Frank's key card, deliberately tried it and found that it clearly opened the door. Besides that, Frank also said he had just gone to the local theater to see the musical The Marriage of Figaro. Cecily was a fan of musicals, and as far as she knew, the local theater never performed that musical. Furthermore, Cecily never believed Stefan was the murderer of Frank. Moreover, during the interview, she mentioned that Stefan wasn't the only criminal among the hotel staff. After listening to the recordings, Susan went to Lawrence again to ask if anyone else, besides Stefan, had a criminal record and had served time at the hotel that year. At first, Lawrence hesitated to reveal anything, but considering Cecily's whereabouts were unknown and her life might be in danger, he finally told Susan the truth. It turned out that besides Stefan, Liam, the fitness trainer who had worked at the hotel that year, had also served several years in prison for burglary. Susan then approached Liam to ask him about the details of what happened inside the hotel before and after the crime. Unexpectedly from Liam's mouth, Susan learned some shocking news. Liam wasn't hired in response response to a government appeal or to provide jobs for those with criminal records, but rather to obtain cheap labor. Lawrence had always looked down on people with criminal records like Stefan and Liam. What stunned Susan even more was that Cecily was a promiscuous and lustful woman. She frequently treated Stefan and Liam as free playthings. After starting work at the hotel, Stefan and Liam had never stolen anything from the hotel or its customers. The numerous thefts that occurred inside the hotel were actually committed by the waitress Natasha. Liam had witnessed Natasha stealing money from customers, but feeling young and unwilling to get into trouble, he didn't report Natasha to clear Stefan's name. Cecily's accusation of theft during police questioning was primarily due to Stefan having a crush on someone else and wanting to end their physical relationship. She was angry and not only threw dirty water on him, but also threatened to fire him. Besides exposing the Lawrence family's dark side, Liam also provided Susan with a crucial clue related to the case. On the night Frank was murdered, most people at the hotel were drunk at Cecily and Aiden's wedding reception. Liam, having no interest in drinking, went for a walk in the small woods near the hotel. He accidentally stumbled upon a couple making love in the woods, probably around 11:30 at night. Initially, Liam thought it was Aiden and Cecily looking for some excitement before marriage, but Liam quickly realized that the man who was working so hard had no tattoo on his right shoulder, while Aiden had a tadpole tattoo on his right shoulder. Liam, curious, wanted to continue watching, but accidentally stepped on a branch, making a noise that startled the man. The man turned around, and Liam got a clear look at his face. It turned out to be Stefan. Thinking back, the woman he was in a relationship with was probably Cecily. It seemed Stefan had become a free plaything for Cecily to avoid being fired. Keen's testimony essentially ruled out the suspicion of murdering Frank and stealing Stefan's property. The reason was simple. Frank was murdered sometime between 11 and 12 midnight that night. At 11:30, Stefan was still busy with Cecily in the small woods. It seemed unlikely he would leave to commit the murder before or after that time. Susan's investigation had just made progress when the police delivered devastating news. Cecily's body had been found in the small woods near the hotel. The cause of death was strangulation, buried deep in the woods. Without the wild dogs digging up the body, the police would never have found Cecily in such a short time. Cecily's family was devastated upon hearing the news. Cecily's death further proved that Stefan was not the real murderer of Frank. After Cecily discovered that the real killer was someone else from the novel Moonflower Murders, that person, out of fear, killed Cecily to cover their tracks. However, there were no valuable clues left on Cecily's body. The question now is, if Stefan isn't the real killer, why is he being charged with such a serious crime? To answer this question, Susan went to prison to visit Stefan, who was serving his sentence. Stefan, upon hearing the news of Cecily's death, was deeply distressed. He told Susan that he truly did not kill Frank. On the night of the crime, due to his depressed mood, Stefan had drunk some alcohol at a party before returning to his room. Moreover, he slept soundly, completely unaware that Frank's blood was on his bed sheets. The reason he confessed to the murder was quite simple. He was an immigrant with a criminal record. In this country, people like him often suffered discrimination and prejudice for a long time, and the police simply couldn't believe his story. In addition, all the evidence was against him. If he insisted on not confessing, he might even be beaten to death by the police. Stefan's words left Susan with mixed feelings of sadness and joy. After leaving prison, she reopened Moonflower Murders. Cecily had told Lawrence on the phone that the real killer of Frank was hidden within this novel. Many characters in the novel could indeed be considered one-to-one correspondences with real-life figures. For example, the couple who managed the hotel in the novel could be Lawrence and Pauline. The victim, Melissa, in the novel bore a striking resemblance to Cecily, and Melissa's financial advisor, accountant, and lover resembled Cecily's husband, Aiden. It's just that these people didn't look very much like the murderers. While thinking about it, Susan noticed a dedication to Frank and Leo on the inside cover of the novel. Susan had seen this before, but hadn't given it much thought. Now, upon reflection, it seemed strange. Frank was an old acquaintance of the author, Alan, and also a victim in the murder case. It wasn't surprising that Alan dedicated the book to him. But who was Leo? Neither the real-life staff involved in the case, nor the characters in the novel were named Leo. If that were the case, why would Alan write this person's name on the inside cover to dedicate the book to him? Full of questions, Susan sought out Alan's gay boyfriend James to inquire about the situation. James, being enthusiastic, revealed a shocking rumor to Susan. The victim, Frank, was not only a homosexual, but also a wealthy man in the underworld. Leo was someone Frank had been involved with, and also his #1 social tool. Frank had repeatedly tried to set up the author of the novel, Alan, with Leo. However, although James had heard of Leo, he had never met him. Moreover, this Leo had disappeared from the underworld for 10 years. As far as James knew, Leo seemed to be from Melbourne, Australia. Australia. Once, while James was chatting with the author of the novel Alan and Frank, Alan had teased Frank about why his young boyfriend Leo from Melbourne hadn't joined them. Considering the vast amount of information James revealed, Leo and the victim Frank had a complicated relationship. Could this be why Alan also wrote Leo's name on the book's cover? Susan felt this logic didn't quite fit. Back at the hotel, she carefully reviewed the personal files of the staff involved in the case. The birth date and hometown of one person caught her attention. Looking at the information before her, a flash of insight struck Susan. She pieced together all the chaotic clues in her head and finally understood the whole truth about the murders of Frank and Cecily. Susan then gathered everyone involved in the case in the hotel lobby and began to present her deductions. Just as Cecily had said on the phone, Alan, the author of Moonflower Murders, had hidden the name of Frank's killer within his novel. The real culprit was Leo, whose name was on the cover of the novel. In English, Leo, besides being a given name, also means the Leo zodiac sign. Of all the staff involved in the case, only Cecily's husband, Aidan, was a Leo. This was probably one of the reasons why Cecily, who was superstitious about astrology, married Aidan. Cecily was a Sagittarius. According to astrology, Sagittarius and Leo are a perfect match. The hotel's fitness trainer, Kian, had mentioned that Aidan had a tadpole tattoo on his right shoulder. In reality, this tattoo wasn't a tadpole, but a simplified symbol for the Leo zodiac sign. Furthermore, Alan once teased Frank in front of his boyfriend, asking why his younger boyfriend Leo wasn't at the gathering. This was actually just a joke. Leo wasn't actually from Melbourne, Australia, but was born in a small town called Melbourne in Derby, England. Susan, while reviewing records, discovered that Cecily's husband, Aidan, was from this small town. From this, Susan deduced that Aidan was Frank's former younger boyfriend, Leo. To be precise, Leo was the stage name Aidan used when he was still gay. Later, Aidan became acquainted with Cecily, whose parents owned a hotel. To facilitate his entry into the wealthy family, Aidan declared his complete withdrawal from the gay community. But what he never expected was that, the day before he and Cecily's wedding, Frank checked into the hotel where the wedding was being held and quickly recognized Aidan. Frank is a man of terrible character. Instead of directly addressing Aidan, he devised a despicable plan. During an interview with Alan, Cecily revealed that Frank had come to see her and Aidan on the day of the crime. He lied, claiming his room key wouldn't open the door. He also said he had just returned from seeing the opera, The Marriage of Figaro. This was a highly provocative insinuation. The Marriage of Figaro is a famous work by Mozart, telling the story of a count who, lusting after a maid, used every means to prevent her marriage to her fiancé. He even forced the maid to spend the night with him on her wedding night. Frank was clearly trying to force Aidan to relive the memories of the night before his wedding. Aidan, unwilling to let Frank toy with him and worried about his dark past being exposed, conceived the idea of murder. To ensure his escape punishment after the crime, Aidan found a scapegoat, and that unfortunate person was Stefan, a maintenance worker at the hotel. Aidan chose Stefan, not only because of his criminal record, but also because Stefan and Cecily had an illicit relationship. From the first time Susan met Stefan in prison, she noticed a striking resemblance between Cecily's daughter and Stefan. If Susan wasn't mistaken, Cecily's daughter was likely Stefan's child, and the woman Liam saw passionately making love to Stefan in the woods near the hotel around 11:30 on the night of the crime was most likely not Cecily herself, but Cecily's younger sister. Taking advantage of this confusion, Aidan disguised himself as Stefan to sneak into Frank's room and kill him. Frank still thought Aidan had come to spend the night with him, but before he could react, he was dead. To frame Stefan for the murder, Frank deliberately made dog barking noises on the second floor to attract the attention of the receptionist on duty on the first floor, making him mistakenly believe that Stefan had passed by Frank's room during the time of the crime. After committing the murder, Aidan returned to the scene of the pre-wedding party. By then, Stefan and Cecily had also returned. Aidan secretly put sleeping pills in Stefan's drink, causing him to fall asleep upon returning to the dormitory. Taking advantage of this, Aidan dripped a few drops of Frank's blood onto his bedsheets and hid the money he had stolen from Frank in a book at the edge of the woods. As for Stefan's confession, besides fearing being beaten to death by the police, it was also to protect Cecily's reputation. If he told the truth, their relationship would surely be exposed. Cecily, however, remained steadfast in her belief that Stefan was not the culprit, because she was enjoying herself with him in the small forest around the time of the crime. Alan, the author of Moonflower Murders, knew Aidan and Frank very well, so he easily deduced the truth of the case. But if he revealed the truth, Aidan's past would certainly be exposed as well. As a renowned writer, Alan naturally didn't want to ruin his reputation, but he still concealed the truth in his novel, in which the character corresponding to Aidan in the novel is Marsh, the victim Melissa's personal financial advisor. Marsh's license plate number is L10L05, where the L10L0N can be interpreted credited as Leon, which also means lion. It's clear that Alan had already embedded details in the book that foreshadowed Aiden's identity as Leo. While reading the novel, Cecily clearly discovered this secret. However, she was killed by Aiden before she could reveal the truth. After hearing Susan's carefully crafted logical reasoning, Aiden was forced to confess his crime. With Aiden's arrest, Susan completed her own investigation. Taking the £10,000 she received as payment from Lawrence, she returned to the Greek island to continue her successful guesthouse business with her boyfriend. She also brought back Alan's notebook containing the notes for the novel Moonflower Murders. Since the case was closed, Susan threw the notebooks into a fire to burn them as a way of returning them to the person who had harmed Alan. However, what she didn't know was that when Alan drafted the novel, besides writing the killer's pseudonym on the cover, he also concealed the killer's real name within the story. In the novel, Detective Pun's assistant, Kane, is also one of the culprits in the case described in the book. Kane's full name is Madeline Kane, while Aiden's real name is Aiden McNeil. The letters in their real names are identical. If you separate and rearrange the letters in Kane's name, you can see Aiden's full name. This means Alan used a wordplay from the book to expose Aiden's identity as the real culprit. That's all for the video. Thank you for watching, goodbye, and see you in the next videos.